going to move on now and transition out of the DISC personality style portion of this presentation and move into a thing called emotional intelligence. Now, we first encountered this emotional intelligence in a thing that was called socio-emotional effects when we were discussing the effective and ineffective styles of leadership in the tridimensional models that we left video before last. The DISC, D-I-S-C, personalities are really the underpinnings of the EIQ competencies. Uh, it's the ability for the leader to understand his own emotions, responses, recognize emotional responses from those they are leading, and then have the ability to control their own appropriately. As a review, if you remember the DISC behavior models by William Marston back in the 1900s have been purified and matured to the point where they're pretty solid with regard to identifying the different personality traits or styles that an individuals have. And for instance, the D stood for dominance, where a person was wanting to maintain control over everything that was going on around them. And influence was one that was more social acting and sharing and having relationships with individuals that are interest to them. You got the steadfastness, which is the person that is always responsible and wanting to do everything right and move things in accordance with the existing standards. And then you got the compliance person there that has an ability to stick to the rules and make sure that everything is according to plan. Now, the moving along here, when we have a basic understanding of DISC, it's going to lead us, or at least help us, understand a little bit more about this thing called emotional intelligence and its theories. And we're going to find out it's going to rely a whole lot upon the leader itself. We're going to discuss a lot about the leader here with regard to his or her ability to be able to understand the impacts of that person's behavior on his followers. Now, emotional intelligence, I'm going to use references from Dan Coleman's book on primal leadership, which is my primary reference to this, but I also are pulling in things from him when he was working with emotional intelligence on his book by Batten Books. So let's define it. Emotional intelligence is defined as a person's self-awareness and confidence, self-control, commitment, and integrity, and a person's ability to communicate and initiate change. Now, I just want to briefly talk to this just a little bit more. The concept of social emotional aspects refers to a person initiating and cultivating and responding to others, to form a relationship with other people in their lives, such as their parents and relatives and friends. And sometimes it could be short term or it could be long term, long standing. For instance, if you're in a project or you're trying to disciple a disciple. Typically, they're with familiar people, but doesn't exclude unfamiliar people to you. It can span the spectrum of how people interact with each other, and how they manage to communicate and cope with adversity and stress and establish positive relationships and capacities to develop relationship with peers, and often sometimes through just communications. You'll see here from a quote from James Perella. He was the president CIO, or CEO, I'm sorry, of Ingersoll Rand. And he says, among other things, this set of skills, and he's talking about emotional intelligence, includes the following competencies. to be able to communicate or listening openly and sending convincing messages, managing conflict, which entails negotiating and resolving disagreements, inspiring and guiding individuals and groups as a leader, initiating and managing change, and collaborating and cooperating with others toward a shared goal. Now, this sounds a whole lot like some of the diagrams that we've been going through in the 4 stages of the maturity and willingness plan. But the thing I want to point out here, you'll see here that I'm going to be highlighting particular words within this presentation to communicate specific things. Most of those words will be verbs. That means that the leader has the responsibility for communicating and listening. He or she has the responsibility to manage conflict and negotiate and resolve them. They have the responsibility for inspiring the people that they're leading and guiding them. They have the responsibility for initiating and managing any changes that are going on with either the curriculum or the scope of the project or the nature of the change that the disciples have to go through. And then finally, they have a responsibility for collaborating and cooperating with others among shared goals. Now, this was from James Perrell. So what I want you to get out of this as you see these slides is that a whole lot has to do with the leader stepping out of his or her comfort zone and beginning to understand himself in a way he or she hasn't understood before, but in the light of the individual they are leading or discipling. So the 3 most important aspects of emotional intelligence for a leader, leader's ability to make effective decisions, is self-awareness. He or she's got to be aware of his emotions, certainly communications and their influence on other people, and then finally commitment and integrity. Now, these are all things, incidentally, that you can look at and gauge yourself. Remember the least preferred coworker survey that we went through with regard to the leader and their ability to be able to impact a change on an organization, and they were given scores of whether they were people-oriented or whether they were carefree, or whether or not they were really enjoyed the relationships above getting things done. So all of those things, you see the self-awareness and communications are part and parcel to this. Now, many managers, according to Dan Coleman in his book on emotional intelligence, Working with Emotional Intelligence, he says many leaders who do not develop these emotional intelligence skills have difficulty building good relationships, not only with their peers and subordinates and superiors, but also outside the organization with the clients. So it's important for us to understand what it is that we can do and what these things are. So central to this emotional intelligence, is a thing called resonance. And it's important that we understand that resonance is fundamentally rests on the leader's ability to accurately perceive and moderate the effects of his self-awareness has on the idea of resonance, which involves being able to look at who you're leading or discipling and understanding exactly how it is that you can affect positive change. Sometimes emotions are essentially contagious. If the person leading it, if he has a good attitude or a good reputation that's positive. If on the other hand, if not, it will flow through the people being led like a virus. The attitude and energy can infect the following, for better or for worse, in those situations. And then the ability for the leader to perceive and influence the flow of emotions between themselves and others is critical to resonance, resonance of the relationship. So let's look at what this thing. Let's look at what emotional intelligence really is. Here's a slide I created once upon a time when I was teaching at ITT Tech, and this is a slide that I used to identify a thing called a dynamic teaching model. Now we could remove the word teaching and put in leader, a dynamic leadership model, and it would mean the same thing, because we're going to be talking about the student or the follower here and understanding what it is that their current position is, particularly their maturity in our four quadrant flow of becoming a disciple, what particular interests they have or talents that they have as a disciple coming into our church. Perhaps gender has a role in this as well. We need to understand what that person's motives are. Why are they in this particular task or this path that we're working them along, and understand their motives and see whether they're genuine or not. We need to understand their strengths, what they're good at, and their talents, what God gave them to use as a disciple. And we need to be a little bit perceptive with regard to their preferences about how it is that they engage with other people, how they learn things, and how they came about to the point of wanting to be a Christian. The teacher themselves or the leader will also have a role to play in this model. And in here, we want to look at the EI competencies. In other words, the things that we're going to look in a little bit deeper for, the emotional intelligent ones. And we just had a laundry list of those things, none the least of self-awareness and communications and influence, and also the maintaining integrity and commitment to the disciples that they're mentoring. In addition to that, the teacher or the leader needs to understand what strengths they have, uh, what competencies they have with regard to teaching, and particularly in discipling, and then what their subject competencies are. Maybe these particular leaders are uh, competencies are on the early stages where we're just inviting a Christian in and talking to them and getting them used to it. Maybe they're a group leader or a small group leader. Maybe they're a missions leader or a missionary leader. Or perhaps they're out on their own and actually creating their own ministries and on their own missions. And so looking at the leader themselves and their particular competencies will in fact shadow, if you will, all of the followers on their maturity, interest, gender, motives, and so forth. But we need to understand also the idea of what the subject matter is here. Now, we haven't got too much into this. We have a flow of how they mature and how they mature in the leader in the four chair and disciple shift models. But what we don't, and we have some general understanding with regard to how the relationship be there and also the types of influences a particular leader has. But we haven't talked a whole lot about particular subject matter. What do you do in this particular stage as opposed to the next stage, as opposed to the other stage? And so each of those requires some skill sets on the ability to be able to teach and preach and guide and mentor and encourage and do those types of things. But it also requires some knowledge on the individual leader. But in this, we're also going to assess the skills of the follower and the knowledge of the followers with regard to bringing them on through the disciple leadership models. Now, in the knowledge and skill, we have to understand, as we move them from one stage to the next, what are the prerequisites? What education and knowledge do they need to have? Do they need to have Bible study as with regard to the student to move them from one stage to the next? Is the knowledge of the Bible or of the gospel and that required? Are there some training and skills? And then training, when you think of training and skills, we'll go back to the Bible in later portions of this, not this presentation, but the following presentations when we talk about how to implement this. But how do you teach someone, or how do you train someone to be a disciple leader? What type of skills and training do they need to have? Is it communications training? Is it Bible training? Is it coaching? Is it how to speak? Is it how to be persuasive? All those have subject knowledge components that can be applied to both the follower as they come along, as well as the teacher or the leader as they go along. The other thing is the complexity of the things that we're trying to have the disciple do. And in this particular thing, I use this as a pure teaching model in a technology school, and there's in ITT Tech, and there's a thing called the magic number 7. And basically what this amounts to is, on average, any given person can hold in their mind 7 items concurrently to manage, to juggle them around, plus or minus 2. Now what that means is that as you present material, or as you train, or as you expose these people to different components, if in fact they get overwhelmed by the number of moving parts, if you will, then we need to be careful and understand that. I've got a slide later I'll show you when we get into relationships about what my wife's mind looks like and what my mind looks like. And it's kind of fun. The other thing is we need to understand how the lessons are organized with regard to the skill, the knowledge, and subject matter. And our lessons are, if you will, the career path of the disciple that goes through the discipleship 5 models, or go through the 4-chair model in those different stages with the relationship and those things where we finally end up turning them on their own and having them become disciple makers. So you have to understand, we're talking about resonance here. And if you look here, I just put in a little line right here in between, and then you're going to split these circles right down the middle of all of them. And in this particular area here, where the follower and the teacher and the skill and the knowledge and the subject all migrate together. Now this is called it's education and it's training on both sides of these, but this is called resonance. And the resonance is when you're able to take both skill and knowledge of the subject, portion it out with regard to whether it's education, meaning information, or training, meaning skills, and the leader and the follower synchronize on the path, and you get into this little area right here, and that's called resonance, when everything is working the way it's supposed to be. Now, I use this diagram to triage issues when I was teaching, to understand if in fact the information wasn't getting through. Is it the student? Is it the teacher? Is it the knowledge? Is it skill? Is it prerequisite? And kind of triage all of that so that I could move these students forward on the path. So now, do you get the idea that resonance really involves the concept of relationships? Well, emotional intelligence is kind of a combination of competencies, and it includes managing and monitoring the leader's his or her own emotions, and correctly gauging the emotional state, and also influencing opinions and behavior. Now notice we have a lot of verbs here, and what we want to make sure that is that the people that you are mentoring and leading, it's kind of a two-way street. You have an agenda, you have a purpose, you have a mission or a missionary, or you have a desire to move a particular person from an entry level into a completely competent disciple. Then you have an agenda that you want to make sure is clearly communicated. Uh, Coleman also describes the IQ EIQ model in four different dimensions. It talks about self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, motivation and empathy, and also the social skills. Now, these are the model. This is going to be the model that we're going to be looking at in just a moment. So let's look at each of the definitions of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and so forth. Self-awareness is the ability for a leader to recognize a feeling as it happens, to accurately perform self-assessment, and then have confidence in that assessment. And basically what it means is that when things are going rough and the leader is getting certain feelings of uneasiness, it's that particular person's job to control that so it doesn't affect the residents or the individual you're trying to lead. In addition to that, it's called self-management, and by the way, it's also self-regulating. And with all of the DISC stuff that we went through in the last module about a person's go-to personality trait, or whether it's a one that is high on his or her go-to attitudes, or whether it's low, that person has to be aware of them and manage those appropriately based on who and what and why they're leading a particular group. And that means that the impulses that they have need to be controlled. They need to maintain some standard of honesty and integrity, and it's called trustworthiness. And by the way, when you get rattled, one of the things you have to be careful of is that you're honest about being uncomfortable or being unsure, but not to go about and lose your integrity by making excuses. Now, trustworthiness is a whole subject in itself, and the Greeks used to call it ethos, pathos, and logos. And there's a dynamism component of that makes a particular person you look at or hear and speak that you trust them. And it's earned, by the way. In fact, it's earned. You have an initial one, you have one while you're there, then you have one when you leave in that particular opponent. Now, they need to take responsibility for their own performance. In other words, they got to be their conscientiousness with regard to how they handle changes and have adaptability and be comfortable with novel ideas, approaches with the work at hand. As an example, as you're maturing a particular disciple, they're going through a process. They're going to have a lot of questions. They're going to have behaviors that they do that you need to be able to handle appropriately and to coach them and to understand them where they're coming from. There's a maturity thing that has to happen as you go through. Now, the last part of it, or the middle part of it, is called social awareness, and Goleman talks about two particular components on this. One is motivation, and the other one is empathy. And in motivation, the idea behind here, and this is the teacher that needs to understand, is that it's what this social environment that the people are in that you have to be aware of. And look at the people and how they work and they play and they live, and motivate them appropriately. Now, motivation is a idea. For instance, meeting standards of excellence, or acting on opportunities, or persistently teaching goals despite any setbacks. Mentoring a particular person and expecting certain things out of them, the disciple, and when they fail, you have to be able to remotivate them to do that. Just a minute. Okay. Uh, they, the other side of this is empathy. They understand the other person's and being aware of their needs and their perspectives, and doing things, positive things, uh, when they sense that, and develop them into an idea where they can be self-reliant. Uh, so the whole idea is now is, you know, uh, we have to understand how we do this. So we're going to look at some skills, uh, on the social skills that we're going to be needing to move ahead on this. Now, this is just a list of things, and here again, here are all those dark ideas. Fundamental to emotional intelligence is the ability to induce desirable responses. That seems like it's pretty accurate. But using effective diplomacy to persuade and influence. Now we've seen these verbs in our four-chair model, as well as the discipleship model about influence. Uh, uh, one of the most difficult things for a leader to do is to listen and openly and send convincing messages back and forth. Uh, uh, we're going to find out there's a couple of quotes I have from Peter Drucker, and he said Peter Drucker is a management guru back in the last century, if you will, but he seems to be the father of modern management. But he said that uh, the ability to openly listen means that the person that is leading, all they need to do is to keep their mouth shut and to listen. Uh, you need to learn how to inspire groups. That's what he called leadership. Uh, uh, Instrumental to this is building bonds. Now, this is something that we've seen in the two models that we've looked at. We've also discussed about shared goals, collaboration, cooperation, and create a synergy. Now, anybody understand what synergy is? Well, it's the whole idea that a group of people can do more than an individual person can. So you get a gain of some effort and move ahead with being able to complete